Welcome to another episode of Talks of Nature, a podcast by Anchor. And today we are joined by Julie McCarthy, the CEO of Nature Finance. And Julie is going to help us unpack the insights of the Biodiversity Credits Landscape Report, where she'll illuminate to us how innovative mechanisms such as this can unlock critical investment in nature-positive projects across the continent. Welcome to another episode of Talks of Nature, a podcast by Anchor. And today we have with me on the set, Julie McCarthy, the CEO of Nature Finance. Julie, how are you?
I'm great. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, so Julie, today we are going to talk about biodiversity credits.
Yes.
And, the recent piece of work that you have done, a landscape report for Africa. But let's start with, Julie, what do you do at Nature Finance?
So I am the CEO at Nature Finance. Nature Finance is a global nonprofit organization, and our mission is to try and align finance with an economy that works for people, climate, and nature.
Mm-hmm. And
we work on a wide range of areas at a systemic level.
Mm-hmm.
We recognize that right now there's around 7 trillion per annum in finance that is actively harming nature as we speak. Mm-hmm. And so we work to try and accelerate the nature positive transition of finance at scale with financial institutions, with governments, with multilateral development banks. We work on innovative financial instruments to support nature. So we do a lot of work on things like nature credits, on sustainability-linked debt instruments. And then we do a lot of work to try and strengthen the enabling environment for nature-positive transition. So, for example, we do a lot of work on trying to advance a sustainable bioeconomy and what kinds of economic policies and incentives can really help transition to a just and green new norm.
Oh, Julie, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And you say you're a think tank.
Yes, we're a think tank and, as they say, a do tank as well.
Okay. So tell us about biodiversity credits. No, actually, you mentioned nature credits. What's the difference between nature credits, biodiversity credits, carbon credits, all those credits that we hear about?
Yes. So to start with, a biodiversity credit is a kind of economic instrument that's used to channel finance into some sort of positive biodiversity outcome. And that outcome has to be measurable, it has to be verifiable, it has to be additional, so that benefit to a particular ecosystem wouldn't have happened but for this instrument and this investment. It has to be durable. It has to last over a period of time. So as you said, they're one of multiple forms of nature credits. The nature credit that most people are probably most familiar with are carbon credits, which, as we know, have gotten a pretty bad rap as of late. And we can talk a little bit about that with voluntary carbon markets. But there's water credits, there's soil credits, and biodiversity credits are sort of the latest entrant onto the scene. Maybe just to give an example to kind of make it more concrete for people. So say that you have an area of forest in the Congo Basin.
Yes.
And it is under threat from logging. It is under threat from poaching of different endangered species. It is a really important watershed for communities downstream and for businesses that rely on that water to support their operations. And so one could create a mechanism through a biodiversity credit that is supporting the local community to act as stewards of that nature and to pay them to do the kinds of maintenance and protection of that ecosystem in a verifiable way to ensure that it remains intact over, say, a 10 to 20 year period of time.
And then what's the difference between the biodiversity credits and carbon credits?
So it's interesting. I would think about it a little bit like a spectrum in terms of how the market is developing, because a pure carbon credit, there are multiple kinds of carbon credits. There's those that are removing carbon from the atmosphere. There are those that are reducing the carbon footprint on the atmosphere. And then there are those that are avoiding carbon altogether. And so in that context, you have biodiversity credits that, for example, in the case I just mentioned with a forest biodiversity credit, there's some sort of carbon uplift that's happening in that credit. So one could price, for example, the amount of avoided GHG greenhouse gas emissions from those trees not being chopped down for logging and the amount of carbon that they're capturing over that 20-year period. And one could then add on to that in the context of a biodiversity credit, the other sort of premium nature preservation aspects of that in terms of the maintenance of soil quality, the maintenance of water provision in the area, the intactness of habitats that are central to iconic species in that area. The hard part of having a standalone biodiversity credit right now in terms of building a market for them is that beyond the carbon contributions that many of them make, it's a little bit more difficult to identify and value a price for those other benefits, to put a price on them that stakeholders recognize and understand the value of. Though I'll say, for example, in Portugal, they just passed a law that creates what they call a carbon plus credit, which is a carbon credit that also offers additional other ecosystem service benefits beyond the carbon contribution. So you do start to see them increasingly being recognized, but also bundled together.
So if you have a carbon credit structured, which has, ecosystem benefits, do you call this a carbon credit or do you call it a biodiversity credit, or is a carbon plus
so
a better name for it?
It's interesting. Different people are calling these credits different things. And this is one of the things that we found in our the study that you mentioned, Investing in Africa, Investing in Nature, which was a landscaping study of different biodiversity credit type efforts across Africa, but that sometimes didn't self-identify as such. So they might call themselves a verifiable nature unit. They might call themselves a biodiversity certificate. They might call themselves, in the case I'm thinking of West Africa Blue, it's a mangrove restoration and conservation project that's primarily a carbon credit, but that delivers all of these other incredible ecosystem benefits around resilience and adaptation, job benefits for the community, so a much broader spectrum of contributions. And they try and quantify those and include them as well. But the primary sorts of investors that they're seeing express interest are attracted to the carbon benefits as a part of that package.
And the landscape report. Biodiversity credits really, really new. Globally still new. Lots of lessons to learn from carbon credits. Why a landscape report, and why a landscape report for Africa?
So there has been a kind of explosion in interest in biodiversity credits of late. And it's not without controversy. And I think it's important to set that frame to understand one of the reasons we were interested in undertaking this landscaping. So as I mentioned earlier, voluntary carbon markets took off between particularly the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016 for climate and their peak in 2022, where they were averaging around $2 billion per annum in transactions. There were a lot of concerns with those credits around governance, around integrity, around equity for local communities that weren't necessarily seeing their fair share of benefits from those credits. You could buy a credit for a forest that, preserved in Siberia that had actually burnt down several years before, and the system wouldn't necessarily surface that. There was one news story, for example, that was very widely covered about an indigenous population in Kenya, the Ogiek people, who were displaced from their land in order for the government to plant monoculture forest carbon credits, not good for biodiversity, not great for indigenous people. So that kind of crisis of confidence and integrity happened in 2022 right around the time that this whole awareness of the global biodiversity crisis, that we've lost 70% of global biodiversity since 1970, that all of these countries are coming together to sign this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework around that time, and recognizing that we need at least $200 billion per annum to finance nature preservation, conservation, restoration, and that the private sector has a really important role to potentially play in contributing to that overall amount. But to date, we've seen a really small contribution. So there was a desire, especially with the approval of the Global Biodiversity Framework and its inclusion of biodiversity credits as a kind of acceptable, allowable, nature-based solution for people to invest in that could count towards this $200 billion, to see if these markets could be harnessed in order to generate more resources to conserve and protect biodiversity. So, that whole movement to explore the opportunity of biodiversity credits coming at the crisis of confidence with carbon credits. So really, it's sort of on the one hand an unfortunate intersection, but on the other hand, I think maybe a blessing in disguise, because God forbid that biodiversity credit markets had suddenly taken off with the same kind of Wild West governance approach. And it really has forced this community to reckon with what standards and governance need to look like to ensure that any kind of voluntary biodiversity credit market that evolves has high integrity, has really serious standards of monitoring and verification and governance, has really serious standards around human rights and stewardship, and fair share and benefits and pricing for especially Indigenous peoples and local communities that steward 80% of the nature that we have left on this planet right now. And that was actually what helped create momentum in 2023 to launch this International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, which is this multi-stakeholder effort. It includes everyone from finance to policymakers. The governments of the UK and France were very involved. It includes Indigenous population representatives and local community representatives. It includes NGOs and think tanks. And that group basically spent the last year reckoning with this challenge of what kinds of principles and frameworks can we establish to feel confident in endorsing the creation of a biodiversity credit market going forward, and came up with a lot of really thoughtful recommendations that I think surprised a lot of people, because some of the things that they were recommending, for example, no long distance investment in credit. So no being Microsoft and harming nature in Peru, and then being able to buy a biodiversity credit in Zambia and sort of count that as equivalent. And also no secondary trading. So you can't, they're saying buy a credit and then sell it on, to 3 other people who want to buy. You have to maintain the integrity of it. It all needs to happen locally in jurisdictions that are governed by the relevant authorities in a serious way. So, there's all this momentum around how to do these markets right. And we were interested in looking at what's actually happening in these markets on the ground in places like Africa, where there, by just anecdotal understanding, was a tremendous amount of activity trying to create projects here to meet this new market that's evolving. And we wanted to understand what they look like, who's involved, how are they structured, are they built on top of carbon credits and attached to them, are they separate, where's the demand coming from, what's the volume of transactions that are happening, and what can we learn in terms of recommendations and risks and opportunities going forward. So that was the impetus to undertake the study.
Wow. And you released this report just before the IAPB released the principles, I think at COP 16. What are some of the commonalities, if any, from what you found and what that report or the principles speak of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there there's a lot of alignment in different ways, and there's a lot of validation from our landscaping report of some of the recommendations that were made by the IAPB. So to give some examples, and I have to give a shout out here to my colleague, you know well, Monique Atogia, who led the research on our behalf, and interviewed with other colleagues at a group called Advancing Green, a total of 100 different stakeholders on the continent over a 12-month period, 30 different projects that we identified and describe in the report. And I have to say, there's just a remarkable amount of innovation taking place, particularly in the realm of monitoring, reporting, and verification, the use of technology to help local communities kind of be engaged directly in the process of validating, whether or not the claims that are being made about biodiversity uplift are actually happening. So I'm thinking of one example with this group, WhatApt, that is WhatApt. It's a mouthful. So WhatApt is using kind of mobile blockchain technology to basically, if you go onto their marketplace online, you can see for the group of rangers that they're supporting to protect the black rhino population in Southern Africa, you can see the named individuals of the local community. You can actually track the number of kilometers per day that they've walked and see the number of rhino sightings that they've had. And so it's a level of granularity and accountability and engagement. And of course, these rangers, you're paying directly for their services through these credits. So they're also having activity compensated and at a level that may not have happened previously, and that hopefully incentivizes the continuation, supports the continuation of this kind of activity. So the level of innovation on that front, in a context where, as I mentioned, in the voluntary carbon markets arena, there's been so much concern around integrity and quality of these credits. It's a big deal. Market integrity is what is going to make people more or less willing in the private sector to feel comfortable investing in something at this point where 2 years ago, I heard one financial institution at Climate Week say they would feel more comfortable investing in coal at this point than in carbon credits because of the reputational concerns. So integrity really matters. The IAPB report talks a lot about that. The Africa landscaping piece demonstrated so many instances of really cutting edge innovation here. And likewise, the IAPB report talks a lot about the importance of meaningful, equitable engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities in market design all the way through to benefit sharing and monitoring, reporting, and verification. And a lot of what we saw in these projects is not what I would say was more typical of kind of eras past, where Indigenous populations and local communities might get a kind of token share of the benefits at the end of an effort, but the project developer and potentially the government, others would take the lion's share. In this case, you see Indigenous people and local communities at the table from the very beginning of designing the credits, of deciding who they're comfortable having buy them or not buy them, whether or not they should be traded at all, down to then deciding, what's a reasonable, equitable share of the benefits for them. So 50+% of the revenues from these credits are going back directly to these communities, which is really important and exciting in the context of setting new kind of baselines of expectations about how these credits should be developed and how communities should be involved. And the one other area I would say that our report really evidences and reinforces ideas and proposals in the IAPB framework and recommendations is around demand for these credits. Because
is there demand? Is there really demand?
So no, right now there's not. There are the most remarkable projects being developed, and primarily demand right now is coming from philanthropy, corporate social responsibility investments, which on a micro scale, it will mean something for small communities over time, but is not the kind of transformational investment that we need to see. And, I think the IAPB report highlights the lack of what it calls policy-induced demand as a real challenge for scaling these markets. So just to put it in perspective, right now, voluntary biodiversity credit markets have generated somewhere between 2 and 8 million to date in transactions. And that's compared to the 2 billion that I mentioned for carbon credits. And with carbon credits, you have different countries and regional groupings like the EU that have actual policies around net zero mandates and transition. And so if you're a financial institution or a company, you have to figure out how you're going to meet that deadline by 2050. And certainly different kinds of credits and offsets as you're getting to that net zero position by 2050 are going to be a part of your mitigation hierarchy. You're going to need to be a part of your plan, and you're going to go looking for good quality credits. And in certain instances, like for example, with Microsoft, if you can't find them, maybe you start creating them yourself to be assured of their quality. But there's no policy imperatives like that right now around nature positive transition. There are inklings of it in terms of countries like the UK has a no net loss, net gain policy that it's introducing. But I think without that kind of imperative potentially at the country level, so say that a group of African countries were to come together and decide to implement no net loss, net gain by 2050 policies in their jurisdictions, then that in and of itself creates a kind of demand imperative for those investing in those places to avail themselves potentially of these kinds of high quality credits. There's other ways that that demand can be created. I mean, also when you look at carbon credits and the net zero movement, there's plenty of places like the US, for example. Companies in the US are one of the largest buyers of carbon credits, and there's no mandatory net zero policy there. But there is, and has been over recent years, tremendous social pressure, tremendous shareholder pressure for publicly listed companies to have a policy here, demand from consumers to know that the companies that they're engaging with are on a path towards stopping harming the climate at scale. And that kind of expectation around nature and nature positive behavior has not yet landed in the same way in corporate environments. And so I think that's on the nonprofit community, it's on government, it's on all of us to kind of create momentum behind those kinds of expectations if we want to see demand for these kinds of credits going forward.
And Julie, you mentioned the regulations. Our understanding is that there are many regulations. The EU, how come those regulations then don't feed into, positive biodiversity impact?
Well, there aren't specific regulations right now with a global dimension to them. Really anywhere that I can think of in the context of nature positive mandates. There are special nature conservation fund taxes in places like France and Norway. If you do damage, then you have to pay, and those payments could be put towards biodiversity credit schemes. They could be used in all kinds of ways, but that's not capturing the nature footprint of a French company operating in Gabon. Or in Zambia. And so there, we also right now, as we know, coming out of COP29, coming out of the US elections, looking at politics in different European contexts, it's a very uncertain time for political leadership on behalf of addressing the climate and nature crisis. And so I think in that kind of world, one has to think about strategies for low middle income countries to start setting their own rules and expectations for those who operate in their jurisdictions, because if one waits for others to do it and hold their own companies accountable. I think we might be waiting for a little while. Or there's other cases where, for example, with the EU deforestation regulations, there's been a lot of critique and concern. So those are regulations that the EU has passed that say that no goods that have any deforestation in their value chains, whether illegal or legal where it happens, are allowed to be imported into the EU.
Yes.
And there's a lot of controversy, especially in places like Brazil, for example, and different parts of Africa around that law, because it was felt that it was developed really unilaterally. It didn't involve the countries that would be most affected by this in those conversations. And, I think that's another risk of sort of waiting for others to make the rules for you instead of setting your own expectations about how you expect corporations and financial institutions to behave vis-a-vis nature and net zero transition.
Julie, linking what you've just said about the policy scenario from the IAPB report, your landscape report speaks of 3 scenarios.
Yes.
Could you just cover a few more?
Absolutely. So we outline 3 potential scenarios for the development of biodiversity credit markets in Africa specifically. Although this probably holds true, frankly, for many contexts. The first is a sort of localized, community-driven market scenario where it's a little bit the environment that we're in right now, I would say, where you have different kinds of projects being developed. You have different groups of philanthropic or corporate stakeholders sort of buying small amounts piecemeal. And you have different innovation taking place that could scale at some point, but at this point is not happening in any kind of coordinated or governed way at a kind of national, regional, international level. And those projects will continue to have important impacts for different species and habitats on the ground. But it's going to continue to be really small amounts of finance, and particularly from private finance, probably not drive the scale that we need to see. The second scenario is the kind of, it's not exactly called this in the paper, but it's how I think of it, which is the global Wild West scenario. It is the scenario where, and it may, perhaps an expectation amongst global corporations, for example, that the world is moving towards nature positive imperatives. And so they need to start engaging with these markets, and lots of purchases start to take place, and there aren't a lot of rules governing issues of equity, issues of monitoring, verification, reporting. So you have 1,000 different approaches, and similar to the voluntary carbon market experience, some of them really destructive, counterproductive, and not what we're looking to see. And then you have the kind of, if this was like a Goldilocks and the 3 Bears story, the kind of structured, policy-enabled scenario. And that's the world we're trying to build right now with efforts like the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and studying and trying to surface and standardize, in a sense, some of the best practices and innovations that we've seen in contexts like Africa around these credits, where you have jurisdictions with policymakers that are familiar with these instruments, that see the potential value of them, and also are aware of the risks. That beyond governments, you have IPLC, you have indigenous peoples and local communities that are also literate in these instruments and the history of them, and the ways that they can be predatory, and also the ways that they can be leveraged as a benefit for communities. And a group of civil society and project developers and international institutions that are kind of sitting alongside these markets, trying to ensure increasingly principled and standardized governance, but really allowing at the same time for diversity in terms of different jurisdictions, different habitats. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. So it really is important to have the right kind of jurisdiction or landscape base for certain landscapes that traverse multiple jurisdictions. collaborations between countries about how they want to properly govern credits in that context. And, there's different ways to think also about in that world how one might channel private finance. So, there's the ways that we've discussed where, similar to carbon credits, you have companies, for example, financial institutions that are directly purchasing these credits.
Yeah.
You could also have, I mentioned in Norway, they have a national conservation fund where they collect basically a little tax for nature that they put towards conservation and restoration. One could have that in a particular set of African jurisdictions and use that to then resource a bunch of pre-vetted, pre-approved biodiversity credit projects in that domain. And so there's different ways to think about generating resources from the private sector to finance these kinds of credits going forward.
Wow. If you link that to the demand question and you link that to the mapping that you did, and we saw in the mapping a bit of concentration around certain regions.
Yeah.
Could you just speak about that and why do you think that is the case?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of attention in the report to Southern Africa, some East Africa, and a bit of West Africa, primarily. And one of the things that's striking to me in the context of the Congo Basin is that we didn't find more there. Now, we know, obviously, that from a political stability and peace and security perspective, that's a difficult, challenging area right now. So that may have something to do with the sort of willingness and appetite of project developers right now to go in and engage. And I also suspect, because a lot of these projects involve groups that have done conservation on the continent for a long time in certain places, especially in Southern Africa and regions where there's already reserves and whatnot, that it's a lower hanging fruit place to stop. But there are examples of different credits like WADAPT, which I mentioned earlier, where they have plans to go into the Congo Basin in 2024 and 2025. So they may be starting in one spot and then moving to others once they've sort of gotten their footing.
And nothing in North Africa?
Nothing in North Africa right now that I'm aware of, but I'm hesitant. Because, we obviously interviewed quite a lot of people, but even towards the end of the research, we were still meeting new people and finding out about new things, and new transactions were happening. And so it's a very fluid area. And I'm sure that if we were at the desertification COP right now, for example, there might be 10 projects that we've never heard of that are being developed. So I think, another key point just to highlight is that this is a huge area for additional research. But one of the challenges going forward is to make sure that we don't continue to just kind of seed and advance a lot of different projects without understanding up front where the demand is going to come from and who's going to finance them. So I think, we're working that out right now in the context of with the IDB and the Brazilian government, the mayor of Rio, not at the national level, exploring what an urban biodiversity credit would look like and all the benefits that come from that in terms of, when you green a city, and we saw this in Medellin in Colombia, you improve air quality, you reduce heat. There's all kinds of health benefits, let alone just the beauty in stark urban spaces of having more trees, for example. And trying to figure out as we go along, what are the mechanisms that we can create that are going to incentivize people to pay for these things. And some of the ideas that we've been exploring are an instrument like a retail bond. So if you and I were living in Rio, we could buy into an urban bio credit because we're potentially reaping the benefits of it, and that's helping finance them. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting innovation on the demand and financing front as well going forward. I hope that we do.
Yeah, Julie, so if I put you, this is a trick question.
Yeah.
Is there hope? Is it a positive story?
I have a tremendous amount of hope.
Yeah.
I think, to me, whether the idea that we need to find mechanisms to channel finance to meaningful, equitable nature conservation and preservation projects at scale, whether that comes through biodiversity credit markets, or we end up calling them something else, or they exist, but they get financed through different tax payments rather than purchased directly, or the Tropical Forest Forever Fund ends up financing them. There's all kinds of scenarios one can imagine, but the work that people are doing right now to value Africa's natural capital and are doing the same work in the Amazon and in parts of Asia as well is so critical to surfacing the value of these assets, to recognizing what's on the verge of being lost and the devastating consequences of that, and creating a sort of coherent, not always completely comparative in terms of the content, but comparative in terms of the quality and the assurance that you get about the integrity of the conservation and restoration and equity outcomes that you're supporting. We need those mechanisms to be developed. And the hard part is going to be figuring out how to generate demands to buy them. But I have no doubt that the direction of travel in general from a policy perspective is towards expectations of the private sector and of governments around nature positive alignment, similar to net zero. I think it may take much longer. It may take too long for certain ecosystems, but I do think that it's coming. And a lot of work, including work that we did recently with the European Central Bank and the Potsdam Climate Institute around the ways that central banks and financial supervisors are integrating nature and climate risk and recognizing that you have to treat them as two sides of the same coin when you're thinking about the science and physical impacts of transition, and also the risks to economic instability if you don't look at the two together and have them travel together in a positive direction. I think that that's going to start to filter down to financial institutions in terms of expectations around what kinds of due diligence are you doing? What kinds of risks are you vulnerable to? And how are you mitigating them? And what are your dependencies? And so I do think that through channels that may not be sort of official policy, that we're going to see demand surfacing in different ways, I hope, going forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
Julie, I won't let you go without speaking about the bioeconomy. What is a bioeconomy, one? What's the interest, particularly now that South Africa is taking on the G20?
Yeah.
And how does that draw from the work that Brazil, had advanced? I know it's a big question.
Yes.
But I have you on the set.
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because again, in terms of areas that I'm optimistic about, I feel optimistic about the bioeconomy. So the bioeconomy is basically the use of biological resources in the economy for different goods and services in a sustainable way. That's how we understand a sustainable bioeconomy.
Yes.
There's a version of the bioeconomy that's not sustainable. That's where we'll have seen, for example, an iconic bioeconomy good would be biofuels, fuels made from corn and sugarcane, and in certain instances in times past, a government might swap out crops that are staple crops for local consumption and necessary for local food security to start meeting demand to produce corn and sugarcane for exports of ethanol, and that's not a sustainable bioeconomy example. So in the context of a sustainable bioeconomy, you see countries like Brazil, you see countries like South Africa, Kenya, doing all of these incredible innovations that matter so much, not just for biodiversity, but for climate, for mitigation, for adaptation, for resilience. So whether it is bioplastics that are compostable alternatives to fossil fuels, whether it's regenerative farming practices using new techniques, and biofertilizers that are made from farm waste rather than toxic chemicals, bioconcrete, biosteel, alternatives to building materials that are huge sources of carbon emissions right now. There is so much innovation taking place in this space, let alone then other parts of the bioeconomy that people probably touch more frequently on a daily basis, like pharmaceuticals and different vitamins or acai that you eat. And so our engagement with the bioeconomy has really been an effort to look at all of the incredible efforts around green economic transition that are taking place around the world right now, which have largely to date, the green has meant energy transition. And figure out what the function of nature is and the role that nature can play in that green transition is. And it turns out it's a really important role. And so Brazil, over this past year, in the context of its G20 presidency, decided to create a special global bioeconomy international initiative to focus collective conversations on the potential of the bioeconomy, how different G20 members understand it, measure it, define it, what strategies they're deploying to support it, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and came together and in September launched these new high-level principles for the bioeconomy, which set out what a sustainable bioeconomy looks like and set out a framework for thinking about issues of rights and standards and the need to think about how trade can better incentivize and enable bioeconomy efforts, and how bioeconomy and climate are really integrated. So we're doing a piece of work right now with a multilateral development bank looking at the interdependencies between the climate crisis and the bioeconomy. And it's huge. I expect it to become a focus of COP30 in Belen potentially as well. And so following on the development of those high-level principles, now the government of South Africa, who's inherited the G20 presidency, and now with the AU, also officially starting as a member this year, which is really exciting. South Africa has taken up this global bioeconomy working group and is really interested in, as far as we understand so far, tackling this agenda around data and measurement. What does good versus bad bioeconomy activity look like so that policies and incentives can start to work on the right things in the right ways? And then they're also really interested in creating some sort of standing support mechanisms specifically for Global South countries and maybe Pan-African to start around how to support people in developing bioeconomy strategies and thinking about regional corridors for trades of different goods. One country might produce corn for ethanol over here, and the country next door may have a refinery, a biorefinery. So how to add economic value in that context as well before exporting. So thinking about how to really support peer exchange and learning and take these principles and kind of ground them in national and regional strategies. So it's a really exciting agenda. We will be in South Africa in February at the Finance in Common Summit, which is about 600 different public development banks all coming together to talk about sustainability and green transition. And we're going to do a session on this whole bioeconomy effort with them there.
Wow, Julie, there's so much. I feel like we need another episode.
We need another episode.
Bioeconomy.
Yes.
So we have covered the Biodiversity Credits Landscape for Africa.
Yes.
You have been able to give us very good examples from other markets. And we've ended up with the bioeconomy agenda, which is quite exciting. So Julie, thank you so much for your time.
It was such a pleasure.
We will be reaching out to you on, as you progress the work in both biodiversity credits and the bioeconomy. So looking forward to hosting you again, Julie.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, Dorothy.
Thank you.